The COVID inquiry is supporting evidence for what we already knew to be true. Boris Johnson's instincts on lockdown and COVID policies were broadly right. Every day that goes by, his instincts vindicated. Handwritten notes from Imran Shafi, then the Prime Minister's private secretary for public services, suggested that Boris said, "We're killing the patient to tackle the tumour." And Boris had a point. He was also right to want to pursue herd immunity as initial policy, which was actually what the experts were saying in the first place. They then tried to pretend they hadn't, but I sat in meetings where they said herd immunity is what we've got to get to. Do you remember? Squash the sombrero, just delay a bit, but actually it's got to be herd immunity in the end. And the criticism of Boris over this period is his indecisiveness. But if that's true, it's little wonder, surely you don't want a Prime Minister whose first instinct is to lock you all up. We don't live in a totalitarian country where we're not allowed out of our front door without permission, without showing our papers, without being able to get a chit from a policeman. Boris ended up locking us down because he was surrounded by a blob that was desperate to lock us down. The epidemiologist, Neil Ferguson, you remember the one who had some lady friend somewhere or the other, who headed the Imperial College COVID response team, spoke to the COVID inquiry yesterday and refuted the idea that he had called for a lockdown.
Do you feel that you did confine yourself to the provision of scientific advice, or did you become, despite your best endeavours, irrevocably involved in the determination of policy?
It's a difficult question to answer. I know I'm associated very much with a particular policy, but as you'll be aware from the evidence I've given in my statement and the statement of others, the reality was a lot more complex.
But as Spectator editor Fraser Nelson points out, while he may not have explicitly called for a lockdown, he did release a report that claimed A, nothing short of a lockdown would make a serious difference to the R number, and B, lockdown would shoot COVID out of the sky. We were also being told as ministers that 500,000 people were going to die, so with quite strong pressure from the experts. And then there was SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. The modelling from SAGE was key to locking down. When the rise of Omicron began in late 2021, the SAGE modelling suggested that Omicron's effect would be calamitous. It later emerged that the modelling only accounted for scenarios in which Omicron was a more dangerous variant than its predecessors. This, of course, turned out not to be true. It was bad, wrong modelling. It was a significantly weaker variant than its predecessors. And thank heavens we had Boris, who at that stage resisted the pressure to lock down. Otherwise, our economy would have been damaged even more. We now know that the scientific advisors were busy over-egging the pudding. So when dear old Nicola Sturgeon, you remember her, the one who has those things, caravan things in her in-laws' gardens, introduced face masks in schools, England didn't, and Sir Chris Whitty suggested it wasn't worth an argument. So in England, we introduced pointless face masks purely to avoid a political fight because of slightly wet scientific advice. Government sources who heard the conversations claimed that Dominic Cummings was pushing for even more extreme measures for lockdown controls, such as increasing fines for lockdown breaches. So we have Neil Ferguson, Sage, Whitty, Vallance and Cummings, the pro-lockdown blob, constituting Boris's working environment. But we now know that their approach was wrong. A study last year from Johns Hopkins suggested that COVID lockdowns only saved 0.2% of deaths in the first wave. Even Professor Mark Woolhouse, a senior epidemiologist who advised the government during the coronavirus pandemic, told the COVID inquiry that national shutdowns were a failure of public health policy. But more importantly, Sweden is the smoking gun. Sweden did not lock down and it suffered 2,365 COVID deaths per million. Meanwhile, we did lock down and suffered 3,416 COVID deaths per million. It's clear that Boris believes in liberty and was reluctant, rightly reluctant, to lock us down. The failure was one of a blob, not of a leader who asks sensible questions. It is time for his critics to latibulate in shame.